Welcome to Beyond Imagination, the future of creative technology, presented by Technicolor Creative Studios. I'm your host, Isabelle du Plessis, Global PR Director across The Mill, MPC, Micros Animation, and Technicolor Games. In this episode, we'll be exploring the streaming boom and how this has affected the world of visual effects. As the demand for high-quality episodic content rises, what does this mean for project timelines, new technologies, and the talent landscape within VFX? I'm joined by Christopher Gray, Managing Director at MPC, and Peter Jopling, Executive VFX Supervisor at MPC. Thank you both for joining me today. Could you both tell me a bit about your role at MPC and your creative background to date? Pete, why don't you kick us off?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Isabelle. So my role as Executive Visual Effects Supervisor is to oversee the most senior creative talent in our division. As kind of supervisors, if that's one way to put it, and to help guide them, I suppose, on their career is one side of it. The other side of it is to work alongside Chris and bringing in new business and then deciding, what that project needs in terms of talent. Who's best placed to do that work, who could step up and maybe be challenged with that new work, and for us to build a team around that sort of supervisory structure, as well as, getting involved with many other facets of running and managing the team.
And how did you get into your role in the VFX industry?
I was actually a runner here in 1991.
Wow.
Yeah. So I started my career here back then, and I came out of art school straight into this business. So I was in commercials, and then I became a flame-up in commercials over the first sort of 6-7 years of my career in London. So that was where my career started, in commercials.
10 years ago, I started at The Mill in 2012. So I love hearing about fellow runners and their journey through the business.
Yeah, that's great. Christopher,
tell me a bit about your journey in the visual effects industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a shorter journey than Pete's, that's for sure. I think what's lovely about my journey is that when I actually started to become more aware of visual effects, it was probably some of the work that Pete was actually involved in leading and working on, which is incredibly inspiring. I actually started my career fresh out of film school on set. I did a Bond film and This Is England and a couple of other interesting projects, and kind of fell a little sideways into the studio sphere and a little further away from the actual kind of content creation aspect of the work. And I think that really, being on the periphery of that really kind of drove my interest in wanting to be much more involved in the production of work. And I think visual effects really was definitely a convergence for me of my interest in technology and my artistic leanings, and also my kind of background as a project manager and a producer. And after my little stint in the kind of the studio sphere, I took a punt and jumped into the VFX world, and started off doing commercials initially at Frame Store, and then moved over to MPC after a lot of commercials and an involvement in a bit of the kind of the second wave almost of a resurgence of episodic and television work. So it was quite interesting to see. I mean, in the last 10 years, we've obviously seen such a massive change really in this business, and I think even in my shorter career, there's been so many different changes to navigate and be involved with.
Absolutely. You both mentioned you worked on the advertising side of things and in film too, and there are such different pipelines across advertising, film and episodic, throughout production, but especially within the VFX space. So before we jump into that, let's quickly assess the landscape when it comes to episodic TV content. A lot has changed since I used to watch BBC One, 2 and ITV. And those were pretty much the only channels available, a very British reference. What would you say some of the major changes we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years have been when it comes to consuming episodic and TV content?
Well, I think you've got to look at the switch to a DTC, direct to consumer model that Netflix have really been the major proponent of, right, over the last kind of decade, and I think the pandemic has accelerated this growth for us, but really that kind of smashing of the status quo, as it were, with regard to the limitations on how you tell stories, how consumers and viewers access content. Netflix have obviously been pushing that, from the beginning and really driving that. And I think alongside that as well, they've pushed the technical delivery of that content. The quality standards and the formats have changed. But I think that's also a response, to the types of stories and that have been told, prior to that. I think there's been a really interesting opportunity in the storytelling space within television, and you go back to kind of shows like Breaking Bad and The Sopranos and and others. It's a very interesting delivery method, story delivery method, episodic television, and I think the change in format and the opportunity to be fluid with episode lengths and the amount of episodes in a season, all those things outside of the network or the broadcast kind of model have really offered creatives and filmmakers almost carte blanche to play in that space.
Do you think the production value of the content we're seeing on streaming platforms such as Netflix and HBO is really rivaling that of large-scale film productions now that we'd see in theatres? Feels like a lot of the content I'm seeing is very VFX heavy, very cinematic, and there is such a heightened production value in the content that we're all consuming these days. Pete, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the appetite is there, isn't it? I think if you'd have said, 10 years ago, is there an appetite out there for that much content? And you would have sort of maybe second thoughts about that. But quite plainly there is. And not only that, the expectation, as you say, the quality expectation has been raised considerably. And I think there's been as a consequence of that, it's been a kind of situation where a lot of filmic talent has been drawn to TV, which I think is another interesting thing to look at. Again, 5-10 years ago, very few A-list celebrities or top drawer DOPs and directors would touch television, really. And I think, that is absolutely not the case any longer. So I think that's a really interesting thing. As the scope of this work has grown and the format has become so popular, the story arcs that can be told, like Chris mentioned, Breaking Bad is a great example of, that as an actor, Bryan Cranston's sort of been presented with that opportunity to be that character over that amount of time. That's a dream for an actor, isn't it? So you can attract the absolute best writing, the best talent to that format. And it's interesting. What's fascinating is it's not been embraced sooner. I think, I love films. I've always loved films. In 2 hours, you can tell some amazing stories. But for 8 hours, you can tell an even more amazing story in hands of great writing and great storytelling, of course. But yeah, that's I think over the last 5 to 10 years has been that in collaboration with the technological ability to actually do this. I mean, you couldn't actually physically do this up till very recently. Love Film, which was obviously the precursor to Netflix, was a DVD in the post, which in itself was a fantastic idea. But obviously no one saw that the technology would enable you to be in a situation where you could have multiple streaming platforms on your television, that you could just jump around and pick whatever you wanted to watch that night. I mean, you were a slave to whatever BBC Two or BBC One were showing at 8 o'clock, and that was that. So, the choice paralysis, I would call it, is another problem, but that's another question.
It's also guaranteeing eyeballs, right? And I think that Marvel really has shown us, that you can keep audiences in an ecosystem sustained for, over 10 years. and now using the episodic format as well to expand that kind of world. I think that this interest and almost obsession, I think, with expansive IPs and universes built around these stories is an interesting trend that we've kind of seen, and of course that's just driving the demand for even more content in that space, and a lot of it tends to be high impact, highly visual content that touches the VFX space as well.
So with the heightened demand for this high impact content, as you said, Chris, have you seen visual effects briefs for the episodic industry change considerably in the last few years?
I think the demand and the scale is the big change that we've seen even in the last couple of years. I think with the drive of let's call it new additions to the episodic streaming space, Apple and obviously Amazon's push into doing more and more content. The spend is going up. Disney Plus's entrance into the space and movement towards a direct delivery to consumers. I think all of that's driven a huge amount of spend in this space, and the ambition of the projects we've seen is unlike anything I think we have ever seen. And previously, for the very big film projects that we've been kind of party to, it was always there was always a volume and a time component, for theatrical release. But now you're adding this extra volume because it's in the multi-episode kind of space, and that puts all the technical challenges, all the human challenges to the test, really. I think it's a huge amount of data to move around, millions of hours of rendering of our kind of CG assets, and of course huge teams to pull this off, and the VFX industry has to adapt. It has to evolve in order to cater to this level and complexity of work across the board.
That's it exactly. I think it's visual effects in television production is not new, I think, but it was up until probably 3 or 4 years ago. If someone came to you and said, I need a CG creature, you'd pretty much fall off your chair and go, well, how are you going to afford that? Because the budgets just couldn't support it. And it was very, very rare. And literally within the space of a few short years, that's become commonplace. And that is a huge, huge change in the nature of the scope that television production is now asking for regularly. But for the longest time, it was kind of like a door they couldn't open for the most part. It was just environment work, comp work, that kind of thing was obviously been around for a long time in TV. So that's the escalation of that requirement to tell the stories they now want to tell.
Speaking of the VFX industry really having to evolve to meet this demanding content and new methods of filmmaking, how has MPC evolved as a business to really address these changes that you've been seeing?
Well, I think it's a process. We're not by no means at the at the peak of where we're going to be, but I think there's a huge opportunity for us as a company, and an industry really to take advantage of this moment. And as a business, we've since Pete and I kickstarted Episodic a couple of years back, we've been really trying to drive involvement in interesting projects, ones that draw talent to us, shows that are of a caliber, and as we talked about a minute ago, shows that are equally drawing high caliber personnel on the production side as well. And I think we're trying to position ourselves not to be not to offer a specific service to clients, but to offer a range of solutions really as a business. Technicolor TCS has such a wide range of skills and talent within its kind of global footprint, and I think we're working to really leverage that in the best way towards the best shows, working with the best teams globally, and just great opportunities really to do great work. And that's always been at in the DNA of MPC as a business, is to work at the highest level, and I think also to create a managed and sustainable experience for our team as well. I think that's really important to Pete and I, with talking to what we just mentioned about just the volume and the challenge of the intensity of the work and the sustained delivery process. Longer schedules, all of that has a human cost, and we've got to find a way to make it sustainable with the right size teams and make the experience good for everybody. Another big piece of that is training and development of our staff, and that's something we're investing in heavily as a business as well.
What are some of the benefits of having this new global footprint and combining your workforce across studios and across locations?
Yeah, it's given us a great opportunity to get access to some talent that previously wouldn't have been possible. Working with people in a way that they prefer to work, rather than be studio bound.
I think another thing is where teams were fairly divided geographically. Now the barriers and the technology is now in place really to collaborate, across sites in a more meaningful way, to the point where we're able to do, live, VR scouting sessions, all sorts of powerful tools, are now available to collaborate with, across the globe really. And I think that's been really interesting to see, and that's a direct result of really the pandemic and the technical, push, I think, to make that possible.
Speaking of global footprint, are you seeing more international content coming through the doors, briefs from alternate locations, with the likes of Netflix really elevating foreign language content? I've really noticed some brilliant work coming out of Korea recently and Paris, and it feels like big streaming platforms are really putting effort behind elevating filmmakers from around the world, whereas historically the USA really has been leading the charge in a lot of that content.
I know that Netflix have this local for local, what they call local for local drive to empower and to promote, the production companies within that region to create content specifically for that region, which I think is a really fantastic thing to do, because it can only help to enrich the marketplace and enrich, those entities that make those contents then become available to other regions as well. And I think it has a certain authenticity to it, doesn't it? It's actually created by people that are from that region, for that region, in their native language. And I think that can only be a positive thing for everybody. It gives us an insight into how other people live in other parts of the world and their cultures, customs, stories, and everything else that comes with it. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing.
Chris, did you have anything to add?
I was going to say we've seen a really interesting, commitment from Netflix in terms of productions that our Paris MPC team have been able to collaborate with them on, and different territories have specific windows and commitments to the releasing of local language content, and and France is a huge example of that. And I think Netflix are really committed to that local ecosystem, and we've seen a strong collaboration really there between our Paris team and Netflix, and a commitment, I think, from the streamers, Amazon included, towards local language content, and it's really good to see.
So we've talked about the rise in demand for really high quality content and high impact content on these streaming platforms. I've really been watching a lot of content recently that looks like it's got film-like blockbuster VFX, a lot of CGI, a lot of effects going on. How is this affecting your VFX and creative process internally?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's something we're constantly trying to collaborate between our episodic and film offerings. there's definitely a convergence certainly in the minds of the people who are commissioning this work, that the expectation is the same. So we're looking for film quality, visual effects, and finishing, as much as we are for cinematography and writing and all of those things on the small screen or the home cinema, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's really, really interesting. And for us, it's the quality is never the variable. People come to MPC because we're a leader in the creative work that we do, and it's really about a made-to-order approach and a flexibility question. Really, I think the resourcefulness that has been present in the episodic and TV space in yesteryear, that has come through, I think, into today's production in visual effects. By that, I mean the way we approach visual effects in episodic has an efficiency approach kind of built into it. We're making something to order. So you might make a CG character for a film that can do everything you need it to. You might not know exactly what you're going to use that asset for, but it has to do all sorts of things and fulfill a number of different criteria in the movie. In episodic, you might make that to order. You might find more efficiency in the process, whereby this asset is only seen in a particular scene, and therefore can be made with some more efficiency built in. And traditionally, that's been a budget driving that question, but more importantly, it's about spreading the cost across a much wider scope. We've got several episodes to cover with this piece of work, and it's about getting the most value on screen as possible.
Pete, with episodic content that requires a high level of VFX and perhaps a high volume of visual effects shots, how involved are your team with the director, the on-set producers in that creative process?
That's a great question. I think what we've seen over time is that collaboration. If the director, the showrunner, is open to us getting involved at the earliest stage to help influence certain decisions that are made right at the start of the project, then I think that collaboration can provide with a much better outcome as to how they're being planned, so we get the best value, and that can come down, and ultimately, if they're open to this, right back to the storytelling. If they're writing a story that needs a full CG world that the budget simply can't afford, then why are we imagining it like that in the first place, is the question. So not to say that they don't have their own ideas about that, and they absolutely should and will, and we respect that entirely. But I think, if we can get involved with that, then perhaps we can sort of say, well, why don't we try and do it like this? Or can we try and previs it? Or can we use virtual production techniques or Unreal techniques to concept it and decide what do you need to build and what do you not need to build? Where can you save some money? And that's where I think visual effects can partner with the production side much more effectively. And I think going forward over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see that happen more and more, because as those creative entities on the client side start to embrace those tools more fully, they'll see the power that it can give them in terms of their visual clarity on certain things, much more so than even previs can give them now. Because even previs is quite slow, really, in the process. You need to know kind of a lot of what you want, whereas if you're building these worlds and you can explore them and use a virtual scouting tools, you can really define what the parameters your project can be, and ultimately what that budget can afford in the long run. And I think that's what all of these exciting technological developments are going to bring the creative process.
Really feels like the technological advancements within visual effects heightening the creative process and the involvement of VFX artists earlier and earlier in the process, because when I started in VFX even 10 years ago, post-production and visual effects was really seen as the final stage of the process. And I think now you mentioned virtual production, more and more we're seeing as filmmakers rely on technologies that visual effects artists have been very adept at using for many, many years. They are involving those artists earlier and earlier in the process, be it for pre-visualization or for something like virtual production, which requires a lot more work upfront than on the post side of things.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the trend, isn't it? I think it's trying to bring all of these strands together rather than these be defined processes in themselves, that you have pre-production and production and post-production as very delineated sections. The whole thing really is a combination of all those things from the very start in one way or another. And I think the more we see it that way, the more cohesive the project will become, the more efficient the project will become. It's not a question of trying to usurp anyone creatively or to be, ignore the fact there is a creative leadership hierarchy to the project. It's all about collaboration. Filmmaking, if anything else, has always been that. And I think visual effects is transitioning, I think, through to being more integrated into the process. And I think, with the advent of the LED volume on set and how we can build assets to drive that requirement for final pixel potentially on set as well, it is obviously front loading the visual effects by its very nature. We have to build the assets that's going to drive that as in the same way that any set build production designer would need to plan in the same way, and we need to be included in that consideration if it's going to work as well as it can.
Are you seeing more briefs on the episodic side that require virtual production?
Yeah, I think it's been an interesting time the last year. I think there's been an awful lot of interest surrounding it. I think there's just been maybe a slight reticence in committing to it. I think sometimes productions have come to us asking about it, but I think in some respects it's already been sort of too late. We've seen sort of a few projects whereby they've been very keen to initiate that process, but their shooting schedule is already kind of upon them, and it's sort of actually maybe next time we'll just go with a green screen actually this time, and next time round I think it's just an education and an understanding of how much this needs to be considered so far in advance, and I don't think there's really the appreciation or understanding of how in advance it needs to be considered, because it's not an inconsiderable cost, and it's not inconsiderable the planning phase, of course, as well, to engage.
It's also a completely different way to approach production, isn't it, Pete? All the planning is up front. You have to make decisions, creative decisions in most cases. It does offer flexibility once within that sandbox, once you've created those environments or all those virtual locations. But at the same time, you are asking the creatives to make a decision up front, in terms of what's going to be in camera, and I think that's it's a different way of working for production teams, and we've been in the shows that we have been involved in scoping and supporting this type of production. It's been a very interesting exercise in educating not just the production team but also ourselves in how to approach the language of how those shoots happen.
Yeah, you have to commit, as you say. You have to commit, Chris, don't you? I mean, if you're going to commission a set to be built, ready, prepped for shooting, then you have to commit to what's going to be on the volume at the same time, because we have to build it as well. And it's not. I mean, visual effects is something that's always been seen as something you can fix in post or change later, and of course you can. But if you're using it in that way, in that paradigm, then I think you have to be seen as part of the set build, the physical set build as well, because it's going to be very difficult to change it when you start shooting it in the same way it would with a physical build. So it's got to be kind of viewed much more like that as part of the production, and then I think it will work really brilliantly. I think it has a huge potential, and it has been used obviously very successfully already in a few high-profile shows, but I think it will become much more integrated over time and much more commonplace.
Yeah, it'll also, I think, start to take hold over the next few years in shows that have multi-season commitments where the worlds are established and we're coming back to sets time and time again. It's the kind of investment volume production where the high investment is up front, but actually the amortization of that cost across multiple seasons is what makes it a viable route to go.
So we've seen a huge proliferation of content over streaming platforms during the pandemic, obviously to meet that need for everyone's been consuming content. But we've also seen massive theatrical releases coming out over streaming platforms, because we've been unable to get into cinemas. Do you think that's something we'll continue to see moving forward? Or do you think the big studios are going to start pulling their releases from platforms and going back into cinemas?
I personally think there's been a trend of fewer and bigger, movies over the last 5 to 10 years. That's everybody's aware of the huge investment it takes to launch a global feature film release. And I think the risk associated with that is one reason why we're seeing the kind of what we would call like the counter programming, the mid-tier shows on the film side kind of moving towards the streaming platforms but on the plus side of that, it's creating an opportunity for those shows to be seen, those movies to be seen by audiences all over the world, and I think that can only be really a good thing, and it's just replacing the opportunities to see that in the local theatre, which purists would argue is not the best place to see that piece of film, but I do think it's a positive thing that Netflix and Amazon and Apple they've been acquiring quite aggressively this type of content, and I do think that trend's going to continue for the next few years for the most part.
I'd love to touch on talent. I would imagine that there's a really high demand for talent right now to really meet that demand for content creation. You mentioned, Christopher, that the teams needed to execute some of these creative visions are quite extensive. And we've also touched on new techniques such as virtual production that are really folding into the visual effects process. Are there specific skill sets on the rise for our budding VFX artists out there that you're looking for?
Yeah, I think skill sets are something we're looking for. I mean, obviously, Unreal talent is something that's obviously top of the list in many people's minds as the future. People that are able to navigate around and know Unreal technologies or any real-time technology, really. But I think for me, it's really about the talent itself, the core talent, the ability, the artistic and creative ability. I think software is something that you can learn. And the way that we work collaboratively with those new technologies is also something that can be learned. But I think the attitude of the artists and the young talent coming through is something that we always want to put first and foremost. Those are the foundations to that being a successful, having a successful career. So I would say that the skill sets are more of the fundamentals, are still the fundamentals of what you learn at art school or university, where you specialise in. Learn those principles of your trade, so to speak. Obviously, if people are starting to adopt to working in Unreal or other packages, that's great. That is the future for sure. But first and foremost, it's about having those cornerstones of those skill sets, whether it be animation or compositing or modelling. I mean, all those things we still need, and I think those are the foundation stones that we still need people to be experts in.
It's a mix, isn't it, Pete, of specialists, especially with the level at which we operate at MPC, but equally there's lots of demand for people who are multi-skilled and can operate at a high level across different disciplines, and there's high demand for folks that can do that as well. So it's definitely a combination of needs, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think, when I started in this industry, generalists were king or queen. should I say? And over time, the industry scaled and people became more specialists. And now, ironically, I think in many respects, the generalist model is becoming actually more valuable again, possibly because of the way that which I think we are working and will continue to work, where, as Chris mentioned, we have that sort of multi-skilled artist who can model, texture, look dev, assets and build their own worlds, environments, special generalists as well, are going to work in a way that they can be more collaborative because the technology is there to be that way, to work that way, which is really exciting. I think it's a more rewarding artistic experience as well. Rather than be sort of channeled into one particular discipline, you're actually seeing your work through, sort of more through to completion, which I think is the way that I think most people enjoy working.
Pete, you made a very interesting point about people being able to learn software. And I remember speaking to someone in the visual effects industry a few years ago about how they go about hiring talent. And they said that ultimately it's the fundamental concepts of storytelling were what they were looking for. And everything else could be taught. But that really positive attitude, the ability to tell a story, and then they could learn the updates in software. Arguably, if you go into a university course and you learn Flame, this edition of Flame, it might have, 3 more editions may have come out by the time you leave. But one of the wonderful things I think that's happening in the world right now is that the accessibility to a lot of those skills, the barrier of entry is a lot lower because you can learn a lot online. There are a lot of self-taught artists out there. There are a lot of free downloads of various softwares. Hardware is more accessible than it has been in the past. And so the ability for new people to break into the industry who perhaps didn't have a path in before is probably higher than ever.
Chris and I spoke about this, we spoke about this quite a lot, and we spoke about it yesterday actually, and it's, when we started to go out and make your own film, you needed a colossal amount of money to buy the film stock and the camera and actually shooting things, and it was very much the exclusive, people that had the money to do so, and now, as you quite rightly say, Isabelle, it's very much open to everybody, and that is a fantastic development. Technology has opened that door to people. From anyone that has a device can make a movie, and I think that opens up the ability to talent. Can only be a good thing for the industry because it stops it becoming what could be or has been perhaps an elitist thing. And when you blow the doors off it like this, and technology gives it access to everybody, anyone who has the mind to do so and the ambition and the energy to put their mind to something can create something. And I think that is extraordinarily powerful and a really exciting transition from what was extraordinarily difficult and financially restrictive to millions of people. It's just been completely opened up. And that's brilliant for the industry because if the industry continues to grow, we're going to need a lot of talent to support it. And if people at a young age start to pick up a camera or a phone or anything and start to film things and tell stories, they're already halfway there to becoming a filmmaker, right? They have that passion, that drive, and that's the key thing to success, I think. The software can be learned and the tools can be learned, but you can't replace that passion and energy. That has to come from the individual.
And for those people who do want to learn or potentially cross-train within the business, what are some of the things that MPC is doing to educate the internal talent or new talent you have coming on board? Yeah,
I think there's two sides to that, really. I think there's the long-standing and hugely successful MPC Academy, which has been running for a very long time now, which gives people a fantastic foothold in the industry. In addition to that, in the last sort of year or so, Chris and I talked about this along with other members of the team, seeing the trend of where this was going and the scale this was growing. And the only way we were really going to address this shortage of talent was to start our own training in a big way. And so, 8 months ago, maybe longer, MPC really started to mobilise a serious investment into global training to encourage and to support. And that's the key word here. We can employ a junior talent, that's no problem, but they need the support to be trained on the show, because they can't, you can't expect the show teams to train them as well as do the work. So we have to take our responsibility, and MPC take a great responsibility in training. We have a responsibility in the industry to train the next generation, and I think MPC have taken that responsibility very seriously, and that's I'm very, very proud to say that, because it is no one else is going to train them. The only people that can train them is the people that have been doing it for a long time, and people that are talented in it, and the training effort behind that, and all the talented trainers that take that on are absolutely invaluable to us being successful in the future.
Well, we do have a lot of ambitious future VFX artists and producers listening, so we do encourage anyone who's interested in a career in visual effects to get in touch. I will leave you with one final parting question. It's a quick fire question. What are you streaming right now?
Oh, it's a tough one. I think for me it's Ozark on Netflix. Looking forward to part 2 of the final season. But check it out if you haven't seen it.
Nice.
Yeah, for me it's The Shrink Next Door, which is on Apple. If anyone's seen that, it's hilarious. Strange enough, very little visual effects in it. Sort of straight drama, comedy.
Or visual effects that are so good that you can't see them.
It's probably that. Yeah, you're right.
Well, I'm about to delve into Vikings Valhalla, which is, in fact, an MPC production. So
that's right.
Very excited about that. Well, thank you both for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
If you're interested in exploring any of the ideas you heard today, please get in touch with the Technicolor Creative Studios team via any one of our studio websites or email beyondimagination@technicolor.com. Today's podcast was produced by Lime Studios, led by executive producer Becca Falborn. You can follow Lime Studios on all platforms at limestudios.tv. Thank you to all of our guests and to you for tuning in to Beyond Imagination.